So, hi, Edward. I just have a want to start off with one thing. You've specifically picked the Roman Empire to study and get your research on, teach with that. Why specifically Roman Empire?
Yeah, there were a couple things. I mean, there was initially a passion for Rome because of a trip that I took when I was in high school. And the thing that struck me and continues to strike me about visiting Rome is there's this immediate access, this feeling that you can go and experience a gigantic city as it was, hundreds and thousands of years ago. And there was something extremely fascinating about that, to be able to walk through a space and understand when something was built, what it was supposed to do, who used it, how it has been used for centuries. And so to me, that was just a sort of natural and unending way to explore and generate and recover knowledge. But the other thing that's interesting to me about Rome is Roman history, of course, lasts for a very long time. The Roman state was set up in the 8th century BC, and the Roman state ended in 1453 AD with the conquest of Constantinople. So you have this state that began kind of in the Bronze Age and ended with gunpowder and cannons. Um, and so you can see just about everything that you might want to see in a society across those 2,200 years. But the other thing is, all of the Roman stories are over, right? They've ended. And so when we're living through events in a modern context, we want to think about what this event is going to mean. How does this story end? How does this process conclude? And in Rome, all of the processes concluded, and some of them were very quick. A war that lasted 6 months or a revolt that lasted 19 days. Some of them lasted centuries, but all of them ended. And so they give us a way to think about events, trends, developments in our world that may take longer than our lifetime to play out. But Rome gives us a framework to allow us to imagine how those things might conclude, because every Roman story has ended. And so to me, there's this remarkable ability to feel like you can immerse yourself in a story, but also investigate and understand how it ended and why it ended. And so Roman history to me is something that's, it's both alive and also vibrant in a kind of concluded way.
So you mentioned that that's like a snapshot of what has happened. Like there's so much that went through the rise, the fall. There was so many things, generations went by. What is so similar about the Roman Empire to what we are seeing now? Because history has a way of repeating itself.
Yeah, I think, are a lot of ways that Rome can help us understand the world around us. One of the biggest ones is that, we're very attuned to thinking about things that develop quickly. This particular event might happen, and we're very good at imagining what's going to happen in 2 weeks or maybe 2 months. We're not very good at imagining what's going to happen in 2 generations. So what we can see with Rome is, for example, what happens when economic inequality emerges because there has been a revolution in the financial system. In Rome, this happened in the 2nd century BC, and it took about 100 years, but this caused people to lose faith in their representative government and ultimately turn to people like Julius Caesar, who could change the situation quickly and dramatically. And so in the United States and in the Western world and in the world in general, what we're seeing is there has been a pretty significant group of intellectual and technological revolutions in the last 2 generations that have not spread resources equitably around the world. And we're seeing the world system and a lot of domestic systems in a lot of different countries all at once coming under this sort of strain, not because the revolutions just happened, but because people waited for the government and their systems to respond. And it's been, a generation, and they haven't. It hasn't gotten better. And so people are beginning to lose faith in those systems. And what Rome shows is that's exactly what you would expect. If you have a strong system of government and people have a lot of faith in it, they trust that it will solve problems. But sometimes it can't. And in Rome, everybody recognized that there were problems with wealth distribution. And they kind of gave the republic a generation to fix those problems. When it didn't, they started turning to people who were willing to play outside of the rules because they wanted the problems fixed and they were losing faith that their system could fix them. And I think right now, as we look around the world, we see, in systems as diverse, as authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes, people are tired with, the inability of their system to fix the problems they see around them. And Rome shows that that's a very long process. It takes a long time for people to get to the point where they're frustrated. It also takes, a long time for that frustration to manifest in a kind of political change that addresses what people feel like they want to have addressed. And so this is, I think, this is one of the many ways that we can look at Roman history and say there are processes that might unfold across our lifetime and our children's lifetime. We won't see the end of them, but they're still very important and they have very significant implications for how the world changes and develops.
Speaking of outside of the rules, Tiberius was like a very strong pivoting point for the way things changed. Can you talk about like what significant part he played in the whole change of the Roman Empire, the way it functioned after his, like, coming in?
Yeah, so Tiberius Gracchus is the person who catalyzes this, I suppose you would say, revolt against the Republican system. And Tiberius Gracchus is a person who, for most of his early life, was brought up to be a leader in that system. Um, and at a sort of midpoint in his career, he just found himself on the wrong side of a political argument that he really had very little to do with. He was a commander, or he's in charge of the accounts of a commander who was sent to campaign in Spain, fight a war in Spain. Um, and in that war, the commander really, really did a bad job. The army was captured and they had to negotiate a surrender. And when the commander and Tiberius Gracchus came back to Rome, the Senate in Rome decided that they were going to make an example of this commander. And Tiberius Gracchus was just sort of brought along with this. But what Tiberius Gracchus had done was he'd saved a lot of soldiers from imprisonment and possibly death. So there was a large group of people who were not elite and not wealthy and not powerful who very much liked Tiberius Gracchus. And so Tiberius realized that his political career as a person within that system was probably over. And so he began campaigning as somebody who was going to challenge the rules of that system. And the policies that he pursued were not particularly aggressive or innovative, but the way that he pursued them was. And so he wasn't going to make a real difference in the way the state functioned or in the conditions of people living in that state, but he made people feel like finally somebody was fighting for them. And so in that sense, it was the optics of what Tiberius Gracchus was doing rather than the substance of his policies that that made him a figure who generated a lot of enthusiasm, but also for people who were invested in that Republican system in the way that it had worked before, Tiberius Gracchus was a real threat because he was unleashing kind of anger that the system really didn't have space for. And so Tiberius Gracchus ended up assassinated largely because he was willing to challenge the functioning of that system, the basic rules of the Roman Republic, in a fashion that exploited constitutional ambiguities. But he did it in a way that was threatening. And that was part of the point. It wasn't so much that he was threatening people to get particular reforms put in place. He actually, I think, didn't have a very significant and well-developed program for reforms. He was challenging the system and threatening people and channeling anger because that's what he wanted to do, because it was good for him. And the people who were angry, they also were very happy to go along with this because someone was finally listening to them. And someone was finally expressing their concerns in a way that needed to be taken seriously.
Would you kind of call him similar to Trump? I'm not saying that Trump is just like for sure the example, but he kind of incites that kind of rhetoric that kind of pushes people to feel like, he's part of, like, he's fighting for us, not necessarily actually making changes, but like incites that kind of energy within his group?
I think that that kind of energy is something that a figure, like a Trump, but I think there are many figures around the world that you can look at who also do this. Um, and it's a very, very powerful tool at a moment where people feel like they're not being listened to. And again, I think we're in a moment around the world, I mean, in all kinds of contexts, where people feel that way. They feel like there is this unaccountable way the world works that isn't taking into account their needs or their desires or their hopes. And they want somebody to speak for them. And I think Trump was one of those people. But I think that it's a very interesting moment we live in because there are a lot of those people. And 50 years ago, there really weren't that many types of people doing those kinds of things. So it's a real change.
Why does that happen though? There has to be something that is very similar, that like catalyzes figures like this coming out throughout like our history.
Yeah, I think the Roman example and the example of, say, much of the world since about 1980 or so, they're very similar because what happened, and here I can speak probably most clearly about the United States, but what happened in the United States is starting in the 1980s, there was a really dramatic change in the way that banking and finance worked. Um, and the technological changes that went along with the rise of the internet just accelerated this to the point where there are people who can become very, very, very rich. I mean, the richest people ever to live are alive right now. And they can become very, very, very rich in a way that doesn't make sense to regular people. They don't understand why the wealth that these people have accumulated is just, but they do understand that on some level it's legal. And in Rome, you had this same tension starting in the second century BC between what was just and what was legal. Because there was also a financial revolution in Rome that involved kind of the creation of a bond market where Romans could buy and sell loans and generate income just on the transactions of buying and selling loans. And for most Romans who live primarily in an agrarian economy, where wealth is land and wealth is something that you can touch, to see these people who are fantastically wealthy but don't have anything that you would recognize as wealth, that doesn't make sense to them, and it doesn't seem just. They would agree that it's probably legal. There wasn't any law in Rome against what these financiers were doing, but it didn't feel just. And I think that we're in a moment now that's very similar, where the Elon Musks of the world have a tremendous amount of money. I mean, more money than anybody has ever had, more money than countries have.
Hmm.
And yet at the same time, we acknowledge that that's legal, but we don't feel like it's just. And so there's a tension that is a very Roman tension, where when Romans talked about how their society worked, they said that our republic is based on a kind of mutual understanding that all citizens have, that the state will belong to them and will be governed according to a consensus about what's legal and what's just. And when you have a situation where what's legal and what's just doesn't match up, then there's a real crisis of confidence in this system. And I think in the United States, but also in a lot of countries around the world, there's again that crisis of confidence where the legal system seems to permit things that don't seem right. They don't seem ethical. They don't seem just. And this causes people to be very uncomfortable that their government and their society has moved away from this basic idea that it should be governed according to what's both lawful and what's good for everybody.
Let's journey back a bit. So Rome was not always a republic, it was a monarchy. So I know that there was a shift, but let's start from the beginning. Like where how did this play out, and then when it turned to a monarchy and then an empire by itself? There was a transition, and what was the transition like?
Yeah, this is a great question. So early Rome is a city-state. It's very small. It's not even all of the hills that are now in the city of Rome. And it's a city-state that has a very unique way of approaching the makeup of its population. Because unlike a lot of places in the ancient world, Rome had a concept of citizenship, but it also had a very expansive idea of who could be a citizen. So in a lot of the ancient world, if you weren't born of people who were citizens, like your parents, in some cases, both of your parents were not citizens, you were not going to be a citizen. And there was really very little way that you were going to get around that. In Rome, that wasn't the case at all. If you came to Rome and you had talents or you had resources or you had abilities that Rome thought was valuable, you would become not only a citizen, but you could actually become king. And so, of the first Roman kings, the ones that are historical, um, one of them was born a slave. One of them was half Greek, half Etruscan, so not Roman at all. And they were brought in because of their capacity to make the state better. And so the Roman monarchy was this system where the leading people in the city of Rome held auditions to try to figure out who's the best person who can do this job. And then the monarch was selected by the leading members of the leading families in Rome and then approved by the people. But the last Roman monarch took power in a coup. And so the leading people, leading families did not choose him. He actually was Roman. He wasn't from outside of Rome. And he was sort of approved by the people, but not really. And so he was seen really as an illegal monarch by a lot of the Roman population. Um, for a while, that didn't matter. But eventually, he and his descendants started causing problems. And there's a story that one of his sons raped a woman. And this sparked a revolution among the leading families in Rome that deposed the monarchy and created this new system, which was the Republic. And the Republic started as a system designed to remove the king and give power to the leading families in Rome, and allow regular people to effectively just approve whichever members of the leading families decided to put forward. But it evolved over time, so it became more of a representative democracy, where any Roman was able to run for election. If they won election, they would then govern in the name of the people. And they also would propose policies that would be voted on by the people. And so for almost 500 years, this was the system of government in Rome. Um, the Republic fell apart starting in the second century BC because Rome got too big and too economically sophisticated for a system of government like that to function well. So by the time the Republic fell, this thing that had started out as the government of a city-state now was the government of all of Italy, with all Italians who are citizens potentially able to vote in Rome. Most of them couldn't make the trip, but if they had made the trip, they would have been able to vote in Rome. And then they controlled an area that was nearly the size of Australia. So a very, very big territory, and it couldn't be governed in the way that it was governed before. Governing that much land and that many resources and that many subject populations wasn't something a republic could do well. And so there were these tensions that emerged in the second century BC that ultimately resulted in civil wars. And after the worst and most extensive civil war, the Emperor Augustus took power as effectively a monarch. And then Rome remained an empire for the next almost 1,500 years.
And then what was the collapse from there?
So the empire more or less retained its territory for almost 450 years. There were some expansions after Augustus, the most significant being the conquest of Britain and the conquest of what's now Romania. But for the most part, it retained its territorial integrity for almost 500 years. What ended up happening was what started as an empire for Italians, where a lot of the people in the territory around the Mediterranean were governed by Italians, became something like a nation state, where everybody in the Roman geographical territory was a Roman citizen and had the same expectations and rights as people in Italy. And so the government needed to be more responsive, and it needed to have more of a presence in these far-flung places. So starting in the 3rd century AD, they began positioning kind of regional capitals and emperors in these different regional capitals. And ultimately, the empire divided in 395, not by any real concerted plan. It wasn't like when Czechoslovakia decided to split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and they drew a line and said, we are now separate. What happened is they just had two emperors on two different sides, one in Italy, one in Constantinople, and the two emperors kind of diverged, and the fate of the two empires diverged, and the Eastern Empire remained intact and prosperous, and the Western Empire struggled to deal with barbarian invasions. And unlike what would have happened in, say, the third century or the second century AD, in the fifth century, the East didn't send resources to the West to deal with the barbarian invasions. So the West was left on its own. It didn't do a good job of handling this. And ultimately, the Western Empire kind of was folded into a state run by Goths. And then pieces of it were reconquered in the sixth century by the East.
So what could have you, like, if you were there back in history and you were like, this could save the republic, what would you say would be the key moves strategically for the leaders back then?
So I think for saving the republic in the first century BC, the biggest thing Romans needed to understand is that their republic could collapse. They didn't understand that. They didn't imagine it. So when you read things written by people in, say, the 50s, we look at that and we say, well, Julius Caesar is going to launch a civil war in 49. And that is going to effectively end the republic. It's going to lead to almost 20 years of civil war. And the republic is going to end after that. You read things from like 53, and they still imagine the republic is, it's under strain, but it's going to be there forever. And they behave like it's going to be there forever. There's a great book by a colleague of mine, Josiah Osgood, that talks about the party conflict between Julius Caesar and Cato in the 50s. And both of them are working under this assumption that they're playing a kind of political game in an arena that is very well defined, and the republic will always be there. And they're playing kind of within this space that is the republic. And it's clear to us that the republic is collapsing around them. If they believe they're playing, basketball in a stadium, we can see that the stadium is, falling apart and the roof is falling in, and they think they're playing a game in a very controlled environment that's not controlled at all and is ending. But Romans in the 50s didn't think that way. Cicero, for example, says that we could save it. We just need to sort of bear down and do the work, and it will be fine. And then Cicero, who says part of that work is not condoning violence and not condoning kind of acts that undercut the constitutional structure. Then Cicero defends a guy who committed a political assassination. Because to him, those two things aren't contradictory. One of them is just this thing that happens and the republic exists around it, and I don't need to worry about the fact that my friend killed my enemy, and that's a political problem because I didn't like the guy who died and I like the guy who killed him, and so I'm just doing my job. And then if you step back, you realize, well, what Cicero is doing is advocating for the very sort of conduct that undermines what he believes has to keep the republic together. So I think when you look at the republic, the first thing that we have to acknowledge is Romans had this kind of arrogant blindness about what could happen. And they didn't imagine that the republic, which had been there for 500 years, might not last for 5 years after a certain point. And I think that's actually a big lesson for us. I think people across, especially in Western Europe and the United States, have woken up to the fact that a lot of the rhetoric and behavior that is happening in our societies do undercut the potential continued existence of republics and free societies. And I think people have woken up to the fact that these can potentially be problematic developments if we don't collectively take action to put our Republican system or our democratic system ahead of our own individual self-interest and ahead of the small policy victory that we hope to win. And so I think that's something of a hopeful development, because it's something that Romans were not capable of doing. Even in the moments where any objective observer who didn't share the arrogance that a republic could last forever would look and say, your republic it's on life support, or it's comatose, or it's pretty much dead already.
Hmm.
Romans didn't see that until it was too late.
But don't you see that history is repeating itself, where people not realizing that the said republic is is in shambles, and the system that is in place is not protected in such a way. It doesn't, it keeps happening again and again. You are a student of history, you understand it, but not everybody does. The man on the streets couldn't care less.
I think I think people are waking up to it in a way that they were not aware they needed to wake up to 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. I think the process in a lot of these states in Western Europe and North America has it's been going on for at least a generation. If you look at France and you look at sort of the rise of Le Pen in the 80s and the 90s, people looked at him like he was kind of a curiosity. Nobody thought that he was anyone to be taken seriously. I don't think anybody in France now looks at Marine Le Pen and says, this is a joke. I think that they are very aware that she is someone you need to take seriously. In the United States in 2015, people thought Trump was a joke. And like an interesting thing, but not a serious thing. I don't think anybody in the United States thinks that now. I think people take very seriously the fact that he is a person with quite a bit of ability to generate enthusiasm from a certain segment of the population. And so I think people are waking up to it. The question in a modern context is, are we sufficiently aware of these changes that we can avoid doing what the Romans did, which is to just assume that these problems we see will just kind of go away. It will be like a passing storm, and we can just keep doing our own little things and pursuing our own individual agendas without thinking about the bigger health of our society and our political system. Romans very much felt that they could do that. I feel like people in the West are starting to become aware that you can't do this. If you decide to pursue little small personal agendas and you leave aside the work that's necessary to preserve a republic, you will not have a republic. And I think people are beginning to realize this. The question is, Cicero realized that in the 50s. He said it, he didn't live it. Are we going to be able to live it and say it? And I think that's where Rome provides a potential lesson, both about what we could do to save a free society and what we might not do and lose our free society.
Let's talk about the positives. Like, so what of the Roman history have can we take away from, like, leaders? Let's talk about Caesar by itself, where they made massive changes, and then just like there was peace, there was some sort of stability in their empire when they were taking over. Let's take a few examples of that. What would you like? What would highlight and make sense for you?
So there's a couple of examples that really stand out for me. So one of them is, I think in a way, Caesar was an incredible idealist, because he very much believed that the republic could be put together without killing lots of people who opposed him. And Caesar died because of this. So when Caesar won his civil war, very famously, he didn't execute his opponents unless his opponents were totally unrepentant. If they were not, if keeping them alive meant they would keep fighting Caesar, Caesar would kill them. But if he could pardon them and bring them back into the Roman system of government and make them part of the society again, that's what he wanted to do, because he believed that a republic should actually value the lives of all of its citizens, and it shouldn't kill any of them unless there's absolutely no other choice. And we know Caesar said this because Caesar said it starting in the 60s BC, when he was just a regular politician. So in the 40s BC, he's pardoning all of his adversaries that he captures in war. This is a principle to him. It's not pragmatic. It's because he believes as a sort of matter of principle that the lives of every citizen need to be protected. Um, of course, then Brutus and Cassius kill him. People he pardoned, who he brought back into the system, uh, they create a plot and they assassinate him. And so I think what Caesar shows is the necessity of bringing a society back together, and that sometimes means taking a risk. Um, there's another emperor that gets very little credit. There's a man named Otho. He ruled for a very short time in the year 69. But what Otho did is he was a usurper. He did kill a reigning emperor. Um, but then another person rebelled at the same time, and in the context of fighting a civil war with Vitellius, the other contender, Otho realized that he probably wasn't going to win. His troops were still willing to fight for him, but he didn't want to inflict more casualties on Rome, and so he actually killed himself. Even though he had a viable opportunity to win a civil war, he killed himself just to spare Romans the additional carnage. Um, so there you see people who are willing to look for the larger good of society, even if it means that their own personal interests are undercut. For Caesar, there was a very significant risk that went along with pardoning people that, might not actually genuinely be repentant or might not genuinely want to continue on playing in a system that now Caesar dominates. In Otho's case, he very clearly understood his life would end. But if his life ended, maybe tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people would avoid dying or being named in battles fought on his behalf. I think another group of Romans that deserves particular credit is a group of people who embodied this ideal that the Roman society is supposed to be expansive and inclusive. And so there are, a number of people across Roman history where you look at them and you say, these are people who understood that the society has reached a point where people who are subject to Roman control and not citizens need to be made citizens, or the society is no longer just. And so there's a whole host of them, from the Republic all the way up through some of the Roman emperors. So in these cases, for example, like the Emperor Claudius in 48 AD says to the Roman Senate, as a matter of principle, we need to let people from what's now France into the Senate, because these people are worthy of it. They are as sophisticated and intelligent and patriotic as anyone in Italy. And when the Senate objects, what the Emperor Claudius says is, look, we've always done this. This is how our kings were chosen. This is how our society has always worked. And when our society doesn't do this, it stagnates. This is a way to keep our society fresh and growing and dynamic. And so I think you can see these moments where there are Romans with a very clear sense of what the greater good is. Sometimes that greater good also benefits them individually. Claudius wanted to expand the Senate because he wasn't getting along very well with Italian senators. So there's self-interest there, but it's also principle that's introduced in service of that self-interest. But in the case of Caesar, and in the case of Otho, and in the case of some of these other figures, there's actually more kind of interest in the common good at the expense of themselves. And so I think Roman history provides us with some really good examples of the kinds of things that dynamic societies do and the kinds of things that courageous leaders have to do. Sometimes instead of taking vengeance, you need to do like Caesar, and you need to take the risk that people you're going to rehabilitate will participate in your society productively and follow the rules that have now been set. It didn't work out for Caesar, but it did work out in a lot of other cases later in Roman history where emperors pardoned the people who at one point had fought against them.
So, but if you go back, you're speaking about Caesar. It turned badly for him. So, why would someone who is in a position where they are in control sacrifice themselves for the greater good? Because no one's in a leadership position to be sacrificed.
I think that's where Roman history becomes very interesting. There are people who are willing to do that. I mean, there are a lot of people who aren't willing to do that. Um, but there are a lot of moments where, say, in the Roman imperial period, there'll be a civil war. And after a civil war, an emperor is completely entitled, if he wins, he's completely entitled to do what he wants to the people who are on the other side. In a lot of cases, what emperors choose to do is rehabilitate those people. Um, so just yesterday, I was writing about an emperor named Diocletian who wins a civil war in 285 AD. And Diocletian actually takes most of the people who had served with and under the person that he defeated and keeps them in government. In 275, the emperor, or 274, the Emperor Aurelian conquers separatist Roman regimes in Gaul, which is now France, and in Syria. And instead of killing the leaders of those regimes, he brings them in. He makes the leaders of Gaul governors of provinces. And the queen of Palmyra in Syria, a woman named Zenobia, he brings her into Rome and he allows her to marry a senator. And her descendants then, just live in Rome. He could have killed them. He had every right to do that. What he decides instead is that for the empire to come back together again, I need to take the risk that these people might do something to me, and I need to put them into positions of authority, because that's the only way that you can really solidify a common sense that we are now all on the same team. We are now all working together for the better of Rome. And it worked out for Aurelian and it worked out for Diocletian, but it didn't always work out. It didn't work out for Caesar. But I think that's a risk that Caesar felt very strongly he needed to take. And it's a risk that other Romans later in time also feel like they need to take. You can keep these people in positions of authority, and they might turn their backs on you. They might plot against you or do something to you. But somebody who never opposed you at all also might plot against you and do something to you. And so I think there is a real sense for a lot of Roman leaders that it's important to bring your society together, even if you can't necessarily trust 100% that the outcome is going to be personally beneficial to you. And I think Romans would say that's actually what leadership is about. Your society, you are entrusted by the Roman citizens to run this state for their benefit. It doesn't belong to you. And so you have to do what's best for that state and for the citizens. And if that means it's not best for you, well, that's the job.
Uh, Although Octavius took a completely different approach, he made sure that like all of his, people who were against him were completely taken care of. Like his approach was not based on principle, and his empire lasted for a very long time. How would you justify that? First, let's explain to people who don't know how he started off from the age of 19, and then things completely changed, and he was so powerful that he managed to keep control for a very long time.
Yeah, Octavian is a really tricky figure because he's the nephew of Julius Caesar. And so when Julius Caesar dies, Octavian is 19 years old and he's named Caesar's heir. And he's a very, very smart and very, very, I suppose you would say, ruthless character, especially early in his career. So he is absolutely committed to this idea of winning and winning in a fashion that incorporates the lessons that Caesar didn't learn, the lessons of not trusting your adversaries. And so Caesar dies in March of 44. Octavian shows up in Rome in April of 44. The Civil War finally ends in 30 BC. So he starts out fighting as a 19-year-old. He fights until he's 33. And when the Civil War ends, he defeats Antony and Cleopatra. Antony is the right-hand man of Caesar who was struggling with Octavian to try to claim the mantle of Caesar's successor. And Cleopatra is the queen of Egypt. When Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra, conquers Egypt, assumes full individual control over the Roman state, there's a pretty significant change in how he behaves. So during the Civil War, he was incredibly ruthless. Not only did he along with Antony and another politician, sign off on the execution of thousands of people, but he also even confiscated all of the land belonging to 19 cities in Italy and distributed it among his soldiers so that they would stay loyal to him. Um, when he was doing these things, he published lists of people. These were called prescription lists. And if your name was on that list, you were supposed to be executed. What we see is when the Civil War is winding down, a good number of people had managed to escape. You know, they'd been on this list, and like in one very famous case, a husband was on this list, and his wife, because no women were on these lists, women were not subject to prosecution or execution. His wife still retained her property and still retained her legal rights, so she hid him for years and supported him for years. And then finally, as the war is winding down, she appeals to Octavian and says, can you please, like, he's still alive, can you please pardon him? And Octavian says, sure. And he pardons him. And so he is brought back into society, and he's, brought back in and is, again, returns to his property and his livelihood. And that is a foreshadowing of how Octavian wants to rule as emperor. So yeah, there's massive bloodletting during the civil wars. But once he realizes that those kinds of activities are counterproductive, it basically stops. And what he then tries to do is to build a structure where it looks like the state, again, belongs to the Roman people. So his powers are voted on. He holds regular elections. There are magistrates who take office just like they did in the Republic. And he structures his power so that it is actually defined constitutionally in terms that someone familiar with the Republic would recognize. So what he has done in the first phase of his career is he has behaved like a butcher and murderous dictator. He has done all kinds of things that are not consistent with how the Roman state has worked and how it treats its citizens. And he does this for a very long time. I mean, it's more than a decade that he's doing things like this. But after the Civil War's end, he reigns for another 44 years. He dies in 14 AD. The Civil Wars ended in 30 BC. And during that time, he tries very hard to construct a system that, again, returns these ideals of justice and law to something that represents the voices of the people. And he superintends it. And it's very clear nothing is going to happen that he doesn't approve of. But most of the operations of Rome, for most of the time, he doesn't have any direct involvement in. He will intervene if there's a problem. But for the most part, he entrusts it, again, to like magistrates who are elected and to members of the Senate and to, to people who do functionally much the same kind of thing they did under the Republic. And so he says he restored the Republic to the Roman people. For some Romans, they might even believe that's true. But really, like, what he's trying to do is rebuild a society that can function without him directly intervening in every single step. And that's really what the imperial system becomes. This thing where there is somebody who is in charge, who controls the armies, controls a lot of money to make up for budget shortfalls or deal with natural disasters, but generally doesn't want to be intimately involved in everything the state is doing, both because, as a matter of principle, the state still belongs to Romans, and this person is just in charge of running it, but also practically, he doesn't want to be blamed for something that goes wrong, that's small and he had no involvement in. So what emperors tend to want to do is say, okay, the public grain supply that's subsidized, so everybody in Rome has low-cost food. They don't want to be responsible if there's a storm that delays the ship. Like, they don't want people to riot and take the emperor down because there's no grain. So they make a person the prefect of the grain supply. And if the ship doesn't show up and there's no food, the people get angry at that person. And then the emperor can step in and fix the problem and look like a hero. If the roads are not maintained, well, the emperor doesn't want to be the person you blame if there's a pothole. So you give that job to somebody. And then if they don't do their job well, you fire them and you fix it and you're a hero. And this is how the imperial system ultimately develops. This is what Augustus understood. When he's Octavian and he's trying to win the civil war, he realizes there's no space for mercy and for incorporating other people and giving regular people and senators decision-making authority. But once the Civil War is over, he realizes the society can't function unless he does things like that. And unless he again empowers people to work within a political system where they can make decisions, as long as those decisions don't directly threaten his power, he's okay with that.
So ruling in such a manner is more strategic than just like, going by your ego, where it's like, oh, I'm the emperor, so like this is how it shall be. And then your personality bleeds into the way you like, run your populace.
Exactly. Um, it's it's hard for some emperors to have to maintain that distance. They want to get involved in dumb little things. But the problem when you get involved in dumb little things and you're running things as complicated as the Roman Empire, you can't do either of those jobs particularly well. You can't manage the streets and run the empire, um, because you will end up not spending enough time on either one of those things, and the streets won't work like they're supposed to, and the empire won't work like it's supposed to, and then people will say you are not the right person for this job. And the problem that Rome has is when the society says you're not the right person for this job, there's really no option but to kill you. That's the one great problem with this imperial system is uh, there is a principle for the entirety of Roman history that the state belongs to its citizens. It doesn't belong to an emperor. This isn't like medieval France or something where the state belongs to the king. The state belongs to the people. And the emperor is trusted to administer that. But if he's not doing a good job, he has no right to be there. But the problem is there's no way to end his term without killing him. And so that is a fundamental challenge that you have in the Roman imperial system is there's a tension between this idea that an emperor works for the people and the fact that an emperor can't really be gotten rid of by the people without
Mhm.
killing him.
So the almost at the end of the Roman Empire was the end of paganism, and there was this whole shift to Christianity. How did that come about? Because there was a generation that was experiencing pagan culture, and then slowly incorporating Christianity, and then there was the end, like let's say not completely of paganism. It was kind of like against the pagan rituals, pagan lifestyle, and belief systems. How did that come?
So Christianity obviously grows out of the ministry of Jesus. Jesus was born during the reign of Augustus, and he died during the reign of Augustus' successor Tiberius. So this is really very early in the Roman Empire, and the movement, so Jesus dies probably around like 33 AD. By the 60s, there's been a decision that Christianity will be a movement that can incorporate anybody who wants to be a Christian. They don't have to be Jewish. This was a big argument because Jesus's ministry was mainly to Jews. Once there's an understanding that Christianity can be something that's accessible to everybody, Christian missionaries and Christian communities start evangelizing and bringing people into Christianity. It grows at a pretty steady pace, but the community is not very large for most of, say, the first century into the second century. But it's growing probably, I think sociologists estimate it was probably growing at a pace of like 10%, every decade or so. Like it was growing dramatically, but it didn't show up as dramatic change demographically because the community started so small. But by the time you get to about the year 300, the Christian population is probably 10% of the Roman population. And at this moment, the Emperor Diocletian, who we talked about earlier, initiates a persecution of these Christians that targets the leadership of the church. What he's hoping to do is to sort of snuff out Christianity by getting rid of the leaders. What he ends up doing is kind of radicalizing some of these leaders, but also creating like a new generation of leaders that are resistant to the persecution that rise up to replace the people that he killed. And it's in the immediate aftermath of that the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity. So Constantine converts because he's in the middle of a battle. He has a vision, It's a vision supposedly sent to him by the Christian God. He wins the battle against really ridiculous odds, and he then embraces Christianity and starts a policy of promoting Christianity in the Roman Empire. He does not persecute pagans. Instead, what he tries to do is incentivize people to become Christians. And over the course of the 4th century, this process of incentivizing Christians allows Christianity to continue this pretty dramatic growth until by, say, about 355 or 360, some major cities, like the city of Alexandria with 500,000 people, have become majority Christian. And by probably 400, the empire overall has become majority Christian. It's a really fast change. Christianity's rate of growth probably remains steady from the time of Jesus to like 400, but the implications of that rate of growth become really dramatic across the 4th century. And it takes a lot of people by surprise, because if you were born in 310, you were born into a society that was 90% pagan. By the time you die, that society is majority Christian. That's a really dramatic change, because Christianity is it's a religion populated by a group of people who understand that this is also their identity. And so they are very closely affiliated both with the religious practice and the notion that they are Cristianos, they are Christians. If you are not a Christian, religion is not an identity. It's just something you do. So for Christians, religion is what you do. You go to church on Sunday, you pray, you listen to a sermon, you take communion, but it's also something that you are. If you are someone who's devoted to traditional Roman religion, you just do that. You aren't something. There isn't even a word for this. Yeah. Christians make up the word pagan. It's their word. The people that they call pagans actually are a category that sees very little in common with other people that Christians call pagans. Mm. So people in the 4th century who are pagans in the city of Emesa, which is now the modern city of Homs in Syria, they worship a god that is a large asteroid, like it's a rock. Pagans in Athens worship Athena, and the temple where they go to see Athena is has this giant statue of her in ivory and gold, where she looks like a person. The things that these people do, the gods they worship, the way they represent these gods, they have nothing in common. And yet, to a Christian, these are all pagans. But to these people, they look at the person in Syria and they just say, if you're in Athens, you don't understand what that person is doing. You don't really share anything in common with that person, except for the fact that you're not Christian. But that doesn't mean anything to you, because your religion is not about, it isn't defining who you are. It's just what you do. And so by the time you get to 400, Christians have a religious practice that's tied to an identity, and they have a very clear sense of how to convince other people to adopt those religious practices and eventually the identity. And on the other side, there aren't pagan missionaries. There aren't people trying to get you to accept that, you belong to a culture and a cult and a religion that is paganism. What you have instead is a set of arguments saying, well, why is it that we have to only do things one way? Like, why do we only have to worship Jesus? Because pagans believe you can worship however you worship. You can worship multiple gods. If you want to worship Athena and you want to worship the rock in Emesa, that's your prerogative. People in Emesa might not understand why you do it. People in Athens might not understand why you do it, but it doesn't matter because it's your choice. And so when pagans are pushing back against the rise of Christianity, what they're arguing for is choice. And what Christians are saying is, they're in a sense playing chess while pagans are playing checkers. They have a much more sophisticated understanding of what they want to achieve and how to achieve it. And pagans are effectively arguing to say, well, why can't we just do things like we always did them? And so it's not surprising that pagans lose this argument, but it's surprising to them Because again, like Romans living in the late Republic, they couldn't imagine that this would happen. They couldn't imagine a society, if you're in 50 BC, you couldn't imagine a Roman society that's not a republic. In 350 AD, you couldn't imagine a society where you don't have kind of the freedom to go and worship whatever gods you want to worship in whatever way you want to worship them. But in both cases, that failure of imagination led to the creation of a world that was absolutely unfathomable to the people who lived through that transformation.
Speaking of rapid changes, and in a way unionization, like Christianity by itself, like they came together with an organized fashion and made changes to a group of people who had not, like written down what their structure was. They were a little more, like fluent about how they were practicing whatever they were practicing. So do you see that similarity with now, where there are groups of people who, like okay, let's say uh KKK. I don't want to give that example, but you know what I mean. Like they have their own set of agendas and they push that constantly. And then when you do not know where you stand, it becomes very difficult for you to, like build your boundaries.
Um, I think that this situation between Christians and pagans is so unique because what Christians are doing shapes the way that we now, in a modern context, think about religion, right? I mean, we think about religion as you are X, it's part of who you are, it defines your identity. Um, that was so weird to people in antiquity. It wasn't how they thought at all. Um, so we would say, like if you're raised a Catholic, but you decide that you're going to start going to a mosque, you have converted to Islam.
Hmm.
Um, if you are raised in Athens to worship Athena, but you move to a Mesa and you start worshiping Elagabal, that's not weird to them. I mean, it's kind of weird, but it's not out. You haven't changed who you are. You
Yeah.
haven't converted. There's no such thing as converting. If you just adopted another god.
Hmm.
There's a great text written by he's a teacher in the city of Smyrna in the like second century, and he talks about in the 160s he has a journal with like his daily prayers, and he says in one day that he heard that the emperor is campaigning in Syria on a military campaign. And so he writes about his prayers that day, and he says, I prayed to Athena, and I prayed to Asclepius, the gods I usually pray to. Because I'd heard news of the war, I prayed to, to the god Ares, the war god, and Jupiter because the emperor is fighting, or Jupiter, Zeus because the emperor is fighting, and that is the king of the gods. And he says, and I prayed to the gods who hold Syria. So he has the gods he usually prays to. He has these other gods he doesn't pray to, but he at least knows the name of. And then the gods in Syria, he's never even heard of them. He doesn't know what gods hold Syria. He has never prayed to them. But it's totally fine to just pray to them in this kind of abstract way. Because in paganism, like you just admit there's lots of gods and there's lots of ways to interact with them. And you may have interacted with them every day. You may have interacted with them very rarely. You may not even know about them. But it's not like he converted from a worshiper of Athena to a worshiper of Zeus to a worshiper of gods in Syria whose name he doesn't know. It's all just sort of one big practice. And what Christians do is they create a space where who you worship equals who you are. And that's how we think of religion in a modern context. But it's not, it's totally foreign to the way that people who are not Christian in antiquity would think about religion. And so I think what you see in the fourth century is two radically different ways of understanding the world coming into conflict with each other. One side understanding directly what they want to achieve from this conflict. And for Christians, this means getting people to convert to Christianity and stop identifying and practicing paganism. And another side that just doesn't even understand the ground rules of the conversation. For pagans, you could worship Jesus. That's totally fine. You could worship Jesus. And there are pagans who do worship Jesus. But they do it alongside Athena and, and Zeus and all of these other gods. Jesus is just another god to them. And that's totally fine in paganism. The problem pagans have is when Christians say you can only worship Jesus.
What else was the environment like then? So was there like, racism? Was that something? Because I know that there was slavery, and despite how elevated their society was and how educated and they were, there was still this element of like slavery. How does one grapple with that and still understand that that they were a product of their time?
Yeah, I mean, slavery is different in the Roman world because it's not race based. There are slaves of all kinds of different ethnicities. And so I think the way to think about the Roman world is it is a very hierarchical place where it is possible to move up the hierarchy. Like there are people who are born slaves who in the royal period become kings. In the imperial period, they are freed and they become like the top advisors to emperors. They become very wealthy and influential. Um, Most slaves didn't have that happen, obviously, but it is a society where it's possible to move up and down the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is not race based. Um, but there is definitely massive amounts of kind of ethnic stereotyping. So you will have, especially in the third century, where everybody becomes a Roman citizen and people feel like this has kind of destabilized the rules of who fits where in the hierarchy. You do see people talk about things like, well, Syrians behave this way, and people from Gaul behave this way, and people from North Africa behave this way, and Greeks behave this way, and people from the Balkans behave this way. So there's a lot of this kind of ethnic stereotyping that happens. But for Romans, there's a very clear sense of how the hierarchy of different places in society should fit together. And if you are, say, like the Emperor Septimius Severus, a senator who also is a military commander, who is also a dark-skinned North African, who becomes emperor, well, okay, right? Like that happens. Things like that happen. But you're not seen as you're jumping the line or taking something that is not consistent with your status. Septimius Severus is emperor from 193 to around 211. When Septimius Severus dies, there's his sons take over. The one of his sons is killed in 217 and is replaced by a guy who's a Moor, so dark-skinned North African as well. So Timius Severus, there is not this sort of challenge saying, well, he jumped the line. But this other guy is not a senator when he takes power. And so there is a really serious reaction against him. But the reaction is not racial. It's not, well, someone who's dark-skinned shouldn't be emperor.
Yeah.
It's actually someone who's not a senator shouldn't be emperor. And so there's a very clear sense of hierarchy in the Roman world. They're very protective of hierarchy. There's a very clear sense of ethnic stereotyping. Like if you're from a certain region, like you have these characteristics. But there's also a sense that like if you've earned your place, you've earned your place. And like that's, then that's fine. But if you haven't earned your place, well, we're not comfortable with that. And it doesn't matter if you're an Italian or if you're a Moor. If you haven't earned your place, there's going to be a problem with accepting this. I mean, another great example of this is after Macrinus, there are two emperors from Syria. And one of them is the Emperor Elagabalus, does all kinds of things that are seen as not Roman in the way that he's behaving. His cousin is equally Syrian. He's from the same city. He's just as Syrian as Elagabalus. When he replaces Elagabalus, everybody is just totally fine with it, because he behaves in a way that they understand to be consistent with the way that the state should fit together and consistent with like where he fits in the hierarchy. So I think when we imagine Rome, we have to understand this is a society that is incredibly unequal. It's a society that privileges the rights of its citizens, but accords very little rights to its slaves. There are significant numbers of slaves in this society. It's also an incredibly diverse society full of ethnic stereotyping, but it's also inclusive. Where somebody who has risen through a society and has a particular status is allowed to have that status, and that status is recognized, accepted, and respected, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. But they still will have, a sense of, well, okay, yes, you're emperor and you're from Syria, but you have this kind of character because you're from
Hmm.
Syria.
What about women? What was women's place in the Roman Empire?
So, what is interesting about the role that women have is politically, it's understood that women cannot hold office. They shouldn't aspire to office. Um, that has advantages and disadvantages. I mean, the disadvantage, of course, is you can't hold office.
Hmm.
The advantage is, like when we were talking about Octavian, that means you're also not fair game for political retribution. Your property is not going to get confiscated. I mean, sometimes if you really are, you fall really afoul of an emperor because your husband did something, the property might get confiscated. But most of the time, what women are able to do is operate politically um, in a fashion that cannot be suppressed in the way that a man operating politically can. They can never take power like a man does in an explicit way. Never is not right. I mean, there are women who do this, but quite late. Like in the year 800, um, there's an empress who rules in her own name. In 275, there seems to be an empress who runs things for a little bit. Um, there are others in the 11th century, for example. But most of the time, women do not rule or run things in their own name. Um, but they also have this ability to advocate political positions that looks like they are doing this completely on principle because they can't benefit electorally, they can't benefit by rising to a higher office because they can't hold office. So when women come forward and say this policy is terrible, it's believed that they're doing this on principle. Like they do it because they think the policy is terrible, not because they're going to, benefit politically down the road, but because it's terrible. So there's a great example of this when Octavian is doing his prescriptions, and he confiscates all of his property. He kills all of these men. He takes their land. Um, he still doesn't have enough, and he realizes that a lot of resources are held by women, and they're not taxed. He can't kill them. He can't confiscate the property because there's no political grounds to do anything against a woman. So he tries to institute a tax against these wealthy women. And a woman named Hortensia comes before the Senate. And Hortensia is the daughter of a very famous rhetorician. So she's very eloquent. She's a very good writer. She's a very good speaker. And she comes before the Senate and she attacks this policy. And Octavian can't do anything about it. And he has to rescind the policy. And then Hortensia publishes the speech and she becomes kind of a literary sensation. And in that speech, she says exactly this. She says, I am coming before you to speak on principle because I am not a senator. I can't hold office. I can't join you. But this policy is so bad that I have to come and inform you about why it's such a bad policy. And Octavian acknowledges I can't do anything to her. So I think when we look at the role of women, we have to look at it in a very nuanced way. Um, is it just that they are excluded? Absolutely not. Does their exclusion mean they have no ability to influence things politically? Also, absolutely not. And women in Rome are extremely smart and sophisticated, and they understand these rules, and they understand how to exploit these rules to their benefit. And so there are women like Hortensia who take advantage of the sort of rules that govern their political participation in society and use it for their own financial or political advantages. And sometimes, if they do a very good job of this, the men can't do anything about it. They have no recourse. The women just box them in and they get what they want. And so I think we have to have a very nuanced view of these women, but we also have to acknowledge their agency. These are smart, capable, very sophisticated, and very savvy political actors who can work politically in a society where they're not supposed to be working politically because they are so smart and they understand the rules.
So how does Cleopatra play in this whole picture?
Yeah, so Cleopatra is a queen in Egypt. And so what Cleopatra is doing is really trying to use the Roman general Antony, and before that Julius Caesar, to benefit her own position in Egypt and to benefit Egypt in a larger Mediterranean world where Rome is far more powerful than Egypt. And Egypt is really the only significant independent state left in the Mediterranean. And so what Cleopatra is trying to do is play a kind of international political game by inserting herself into Roman domestic politics and a Roman civil war. Um, and she has to do it through Roman men because she's not Roman, and she
Mm.
has no position in Rome. Um, and she is very sophisticated and savvy in how she does this. But she's really playing a pretty weak hand. It would be, I don't know what a modern parallel would be. Maybe the equivalent of like North Korea trying to play China. It's not like they are equals. Um, and so what she's trying to do is what she thinks is best for herself and what's best for her kingdom, in a situation where she doesn't have a lot of freedom to do things on her own. She really does have to work through Roman men, and she understands also that the Roman Republic is collapsing. There's no security in the way it's going to interact with Egypt, and so she really does have extremely difficult task, and she has to do the best she can with a pretty weak position.
So you kind of alluded to the fact that, when there's a system in place and when that is shaken, or like, people don't follow the status quo, that's when, like, things change, where when things collapse and republics, like, fragment and break apart. But then there's also this added thing where, revolutions happen when you break the status quo, and that's when you progress as a society. So how does one differentiate between the two? When are you gonna, like, disintegrate what is set up and what could help grow in the long term, for short, instead of short term goals, over what needs to be done?
So I think that, if you compare the civil wars at the end of the Republic to some of the civil wars you get in the Empire, you can see the difference between a system falling apart and conflict within that system. So in the civil wars at the end of the Republic, those are in a way about what the rules of the political game are going to be. The generals who are fighting those civil wars, starting with Caesar, fight those civil wars, well, actually starting even with Sulla in the first century BC, like in the 80s BC. They fight those civil wars because they believe very fundamentally that the Republic can no longer protect them. That if they continue to live in this society, with the way that society is functioning, they will probably end up exiled or dead. And so they don't trust that the system can support them, and they blow it up. And do things like march on the capital and destroy the political structures that were governing the capital because they don't believe that they can survive if they don't do something like that. The civil wars in the empire are fought by people who generally agree that the imperial system, as it's designed, will continue. It's just who's going to be in charge of it.
Mm.
So where the civil wars in the Republic are about effectively replacing the Republic with one person being in charge, in the empire, it's already clear one person is in charge. So there's a whole bureaucracy that can run regardless of who the emperor is. There's a tax system, there's a set of legal processes, there's a way of administering the army, there's a way of distributing resources, and that entire system just exists. And an emperor can do a lot of damage to that system, but it will actually take them a very long time to do that, because the system is designed to persist even if the emperor isn't there, even if he dies and someone replaces him. So the civil wars in the empire are much more frequent than the civil wars in the Republic, but constitutionally they're much less damaging, because the system is resilient to, becomes resilient to imperial regime change. So I think that the difference is that emperors fighting each other in civil conflicts in, say, the fourth century AD, it's about who's emperor. It's not about what our constitutional structure is going to be like. And they don't really change the constitutional structure very much. There are few different examples of people who do that, but it takes them decades to change it. Um, in the Republic, those civil wars are very much about this system isn't working for me anymore, and I need to create something new. And that means not just I'm going to be in charge instead of this other person, but we're going to do something completely different. And so those civil wars have a much greater consequence than, than a civil war where everybody kind of agrees, okay, well, someone new might be in charge, but like you're still going to pay taxes in this way, and your province is still going to be administered in this way, and legal disputes are going to be settled in this way, and you go before this person to argue a court case. Those things are much less disruptive unless you are unfortunately in the way of an army and you get kind of caught somehow. um,
And then your collateral damage.
yeah, I mean, we have accounts of people. We have so much source material from, say, the 350s. We have accounts of people who they put it, there's a civil war going on, and a guy who's likely to lose marches through their town, and they put the guy up in their house. And then they panic because they know this guy's probably going to lose. And they worry, well, what's going to happen to me? I'm going to look like a supporter of this guy. But
Yeah.
like, what option did I have? He's here with 40,000 troops, and he walks through my town, and he walks across my farm, and he has to stay in my house. Like, what am I going to do? Say no? So in those cases, you get individuals who kind of worry about their position. In that particular case, really nothing happened to the guy.
Yeah.
But he worried for sure. He was very concerned that someone might do something to him because he's seen as not just passively going about his business, but actively supporting this other person.
Seeing the patterns of the past, what are your predictions for the future? It doesn't have to be in the US, but anywhere else.
Yeah, I think that we're going through a period of really profound change, in a lot of different ways. I think that religiously, especially in Western Europe, North America, and places like Australia, there is a move away from the religious traditions that have been associated with the rules of those societies for a very long time. Um, that I think is destabilizing. I think the way we live is also destabilizing from the way our societies expect us to live. Um, I think in a lot of the world, the move to very rapidly developing megacities is providing a lot of challenges where the social structures that support people throughout their lives are coming apart. And then that's manifesting politically in lots of different ways in lots of different places. Remember, I just was looking at some of the growth of cities in places like Nigeria and Pakistan, where Karachi was, I think, 100 years ago, a relatively small place, a few tens of thousands of people, and now there's 20 million or so people there. When a city grows that quickly, it changes the experience of the people living in that country. It changes the experience, it changes the social structure, it changes the rules of interacting, it changes the rules of marriage and child rearing, it changes all kinds of things. And a political system tends to lag those kinds of changes. So, if you have a mega city in a place like Pakistan or Iran or India or Nigeria, where the population is young, but the ruling administration is old, you have a lag where the policies that the people in that city need are not going to be conceived by the people who are running that society because they don't live in that world. That world didn't exist when they were young. So they can't understand that the desires and challenges of people living in a city that didn't exist in that way, in a society that didn't exist in that way. And so that's a real challenge, I think, everywhere in the world, because leadership is always a generation or two behind the people who actually are living that revolution, the people who need to make their life in that new context. Um, and that's a problem in, North America and Europe, but it's also a problem around the rest of the world too, because those societies are in some ways even more dynamic than North America and Europe. Um, and I think everywhere in the world, what Rome shows is these changes need to be acknowledged by the people running a country. The country needs to take policy steps to try to address the needs of the young people living in the country of the present, not the country of the past. And everybody collectively needs to imagine what these changes might do to create the country of the future. And that is a real challenge. Societies don't do a very good job of imagining the future.
Yeah.
Old rulers don't do a very good job of imagining the conditions that young people are living through. And they do a very poor job of communicating with young people and creating policy solutions that young people actually want. But that's kind of the world we're in right now. We need having an 80-year-old running the United States is not the best thing for the United States right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's true in a lot of the world where you have septuagenarians and octogenarians and, in some cases, even people in their 90s running countries like this. They don't understand, they don't live in the cities that they govern. They don't live in the world that their people live in. And that means their policies cannot actually address those challenges because they have no idea what those challenges are.
So, being the devil's advocate in this, I would say they have more experience. They've seen things happen. They've seen the changes, the fluctuations, so they're able to predict. Wouldn't that be the case for having older leadership?
So one of the things that I found really fascinating my Final Pagan, I wrote a book called The Final Pagan Generation. That's a generational history that looks at people born in the 310s as they live in this society that evolves. One of the things that I realized when I started writing about them when they're old is they are living in a world that, first of all, they don't understand. But second of all, they actually don't enter much of the space of that world because it's not theirs. So if you think about it, if you're 80 years old, you don't go into a grade school, you don't go into a high school. You probably haven't been in one for decades, except maybe to see your grandkid perform in a play or something. Um, you you never, in some cases, like never interact with online apps. You never maybe have like been to where most of the people in a city live. You never have been to like a dance club that anyone who's young has been to. You don't know what their social life is like. You don't know what their desires are like. You don't know what challenges they have raising children because you're not doing those things. It became very clear to me that like when this generation is in their 70s and 80s and the 380s and 390s, they don't go into much of their city. They don't visit the spaces where much of the people live. They don't talk to young people in a context where young people are going to be open about what their desires are. And there's a lot of the city that they actually, can't go into because it's not appropriate for them to be there. In the same way that like a young child can only go to certain parts of a public space. The same is true of old people. There's just spaces where it would be weird for them to be, or they would have no desire to be, or they might not even be welcome. And so there's a lot about that world they don't understand because they don't live in it. They don't even really walk through it. And I think that's one of the things that we miss, right? They do have a lot of experience about, say, how to run a tax system because the tax system has been there for a very long time. And so it changes very slowly. So their institutional knowledge of institutional things is very, very important. But their knowledge of how the world works for the younger people living in it is not current. And not only is it not current, they actually struggle to even have the kind of access that would allow them to make it up to date. And so I think that's the danger, is if you live in a society that is very institutionalized, that kind of knowledge is very beneficial. But if you live in a dynamic society that is, very young and there's a lot of change and evolution going on, that distance is really a problem, because there's just a lack of comprehension
Hmm.
that I think is totally understandable and not a sign of them being corrupt or indifferent even. But it just is.
What would you recommend then? How would we make sure that like each generation is being heard by the leaders of that time?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. And I think that every society struggles with that. Um, I think you do see bursts where a younger generation takes over, and does a lot of things very quickly to try to change the things around them. Um, I think that's probably going to be, well, that's going to be a real risk. People in charge need to listen.
Hmm.
They need to be willing to step aside. They need to understand when the next generation has enough experience to manage the institutions they inherit and also implement their vision for what the future should hold. It's really important and really difficult to manage that transition between an older generation that understands the structures of a society and a younger generation that wants to maintain the structures that work but fix the things that don't. Um, Both groups take on a lot of risk when that happens, and both groups need to kind of trust the intentions of each other. Um, in the US, where we have a lot of very old politicians right now, I don't think that
Hmm.
trust is really there. Uh, and I hope that there is a sufficient handoff. But as someone who belongs to Gen X, in the US, our generation was too small and we never got a chance. So our
Hmm.
generation got skipped. You have baby boomers in their 70s and 80s who are handing off to millennials in their 30s and 40s, and people in their 40s and 50s and 60s, we got skipped. And so
Hmm.
whatever we have to offer, we didn't get to offer.
Yeah. But what would you recommend to someone? Okay, if there's a changing of the guard, but then there's a lack of trust as well. So how would one build that trust? So like if I am from a younger generation, for example, we learn from history. What books would you recommend? How would you tell them to like, prepare themselves?
Um, that's a really good question. I think that what's really important is for each place to think about the terms that are appropriate to that culture and that background, and understand how to rely on the structures of the past, be they institutional or religious or political, to build some of that trust. With a sort of long-term, multi-generational sense of how things ought to work. And if the younger generation and the older generation can agree on a kind of basic set of principles that are consistent with how that country or that city or that group has always behaved, um, that builds a lot of trust that the transition will at least be governed by a set of boundaries that everyone agrees, again, are lawful and just, to borrow the sort of Roman concepts.
Hmm.
I think that goes a long way. But I think, in the US, that's maybe looking at things like the Federalist Papers or some of the documents written by our founding fathers. If you're talking about, a religious group like the Catholic Church, say, then you look at kind of a theological approach, or you look at a kind of canon law approach, or something, where everybody agrees on the baselines. And then you're kind of working on how within these institutional guardrails change is going to occur. But I think it has to be something that the older generation and the younger generation agrees has authority to govern kind of basic rules for how a community functions. And I think as long as that's there, you can build trust because everybody understands change is going to happen, but they also understand what the limits to that change are likely to be.
Right now, we live in a society where we can't be on the same page with anything. So, so how does one find that common ground?
So I think that's a really fair question. I think that in the United States, one of the things that we could use to find a common ground, if we're talking about politics, is constitutional text. But I think in some ways those things have been politicized too, where the meaning of these things have become almost so well, I guess politicized that it's very difficult to agree on anything about what they mean. That's a real
Hmm.
challenge. And I think that's one of the big destabilizing things in the US in particular. Um, there's such disagreement about what these basic foundations are that it's sometimes quite difficult to find a common foundation. Um, but then I think you move outside of the thought leaders and you move outside of the partisans and you see there's actually quite a bit of consensus about some basic ideas. And it might be good to try to change the conversation from the sort of partisan arguments and focus instead on the basic consensus that most Americans have about the way that things should work. Um, how you do that, I think, is a real challenge because most of the people who would change that conversation are the partisans who are invested in not changing that conversation.
Hmm.
But I think that's what would have to happen. And I think in other societies, there are other societies, other communities, other groups. There are other foundational things that could also work in that way. But you have to, in a sense, remove the partisanship and remove the politicization that's already there and get new voices to speak towards consensus. But how you do that in a society where people are angry, well, that's the real challenge I think all of us are facing really everywhere in the world right now.
Or be like Caesar, try to self-sacrifice yourself for the better good, and maybe society will function better. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are wonderfully powerful leaders who did that. I mean, Mandela is, in a sense, I think, one of the greatest heroes in history because he provides a model for how to do that, right? I mean,
Hmm.
he's a figure who could have done really anything he wanted in South Africa. And what he chose to do was to move that society forward towards reconciliation and do it in a way that created a political system that turned power over. He was not an authoritarian. His term ended. He stepped down. He lived the rest of his life as an elder statesman. Um, that's somebody who really thought about what would make his society better, what would prevent
Hmm.
his society from descending into the kind of calamity that look just across the border in Zimbabwe, right? I mean, that could have happened, but much worse. And what Mandela did was create a way to move forward. And he didn't do it in a self-interested way. He did it in the interest of everybody. People he agreed with, people he disagreed with, people who supported him, people who he fought against, people who imprisoned him, right? I mean, that's a real hero. I think he is one of the greatest people, certainly in recent history, because of how he understood the necessity of his job and what he was willing to do over the course of a very, very long time to do it right. It's possible, but Mandela's rare, very, very rare. There are not many
Very
people in
right.
history like that. And I think there are models that we can look to, but I don't know that we can expect that every country in the world is ever going to be lucky enough to get a Mandela.
True. Of all your books, which one would you highly recommend? It's like picking your favorite child, but of all your books, and
um,
why?
I, so I think if you're interested in politics, Mortal Republic is the book to look at because that's really a discussion of the end of the Roman Republic. If you're interested in the kinds of questions of generations and change, and the challenge of understanding a world that's passing you by, The Final Pagan Generation is really it's a very personal book, because what inspired that was the realization, like we just said, that my generation will not make an impact. You know, we will watch the world pass us by. We made some good
Mm.
music, and that was wonderful. But you know, that's what we did. And uh, so I think that's a different kind of approach. But I think the book I'm working on now is a book that, you know, it's an optimistic book that looks at the way that Rome continued to evolve and incorporate new people and create an evolving society that was dynamic and took advantage of the talents of the best people that it could find to run this society on behalf of its citizens. So that's if Mortal Republic is a pessimistic book about, you know, how a political system declines and falls and collapses into authoritarianism, this will, I hope, be a optimistic book about how a society can continue to reinvent itself to take advantage of the best among it. Um, so yeah, that, those would be the ones I would point to. And if you really are interested in rhetoric that allows people to take advantage of citizens who feel uncomfortable about change, The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome looks at how that's done over 2,200 years, from the 2nd century BC until, you know, yesterday, more or less.
Where can people find your work? And also, when does this book get published, the one which you're working on?
So the one that I'm working on now will probably appear in 2024. So it's a very long book because it's all of Roman history. Uh,
Okay.
the other books are available on Amazon.
Mm.
I think Amazon everywhere.
Mm.
And then you can also find them through Basic Books. And I also have a YouTube channel where I just have a few just kind of lectures about Roman history that's called The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome. So people can check that out if they're interested.
Are you on social media as well?
Uh, just the YouTube channel.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Sure. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.